Hello, everyone. My name is Ariel Wade, and today I'll be doing my presentation on Just Mercy, chapters 9 through 13. Now, before I jump into my chapters, I'm just going to give a brief summation of chapters 1 through 8. Just Mercy is a book that follows the story of civil rights attorney Bryan Stevenson and his efforts to prove the innocence of many of his clients, including one of his clients, Walter McMillan. Now, Walter McMillan is a black male who lived in Monroeville, Alabama. He owned a logging company and had a wife and had a pretty decent life. Walter McMillan was also known as a ladies' man, and he had a lot of extramarital affairs outside of his marriage. One of these affairs was with a white woman, Karen Kelly. Now, this story takes place in 1986, and although interracial relationships are no longer illegal, there's still many racial prejudices that exist. This relationship caused a stain on both Walter and Karen's reputation in the community, specifically Karen, who was going through a custody battle with her husband regarding their children. So the negative reputation and just the traumas of life led Karen down a very tumultuous path. She began abusing substances and hanging around the wrong people. Now, keeping that in mind, we're going to go to the story of Rhonda Morrison. Rhonda Morrison was an 18-year-old white woman who was working at a cleaner's on a day in 1986 when she was shot and killed by an unknown murderer. This murder shocked the community because murder was not common in Monroeville, Alabama. And the sheriff and the prosecutors had a real difficulty trying to find the killer. That every lead that they chased ended up leading in nothing, and months went by and they were not able to find Miss Morrison's killer. Now, going back to Mr. McMillan and Miss Kelly in her spiral downhill ended up meeting a Mr. Ralph Myers. Now, Mr. Ralph Myers had a bad reputation. He had trouble with law enforcement, was into substances, and just was the wrong type of party for Miss Karen to be getting involved with. Miss Myers and Mr. Kelly ended up killing another woman in another unrelated incident in another city. And in order to alleviate his sentence in the murder of this other woman, Mr. Myers concocted this story that Walter McMillan had forced him into a vehicle and forced him to be his accomplice in the murder of Rhonda Morrison on that morning in 1986. Now, Mr. Myers did not know Mr. McMillan. He only knew of him based on the rumors he heard of Mr. McMillan's affair with Miss Kelly. So, Mr. Myers concocted this story and gave it to the sheriff's office, who, of course, ran with the story. And they arrested and charged McMillan with murder. And now the story had several holes. The story constantly changed. It was inconsistent. It didn't match with the evidence. But the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Tate, needed a win. He was getting pressure from the community because Miss Morrison's murder had still not been solved. So he charged McMillan and Myers with the murder of Miss Morrison. So Myers, now realizing that he's now being charged with another murder that he had nothing to do with, recanted his testimony, alleging that it was all false. He didn't know McMillan, and he made it up so that he can get less time for another murder. Sheriff Tate and the prosecutor, Mr. Tom Pearson, who was also a big factor in the wrongful conviction of Walter McMillan. The prosecutor, Mr. Tom Pearson, was also up for retirement at this time, and he was facing a lot of pressure from the community, and he needed to win. So, in order to pressure Myers into keeping his testimony and testifying against McMillan in court, Sheriff Tate placed McMillan and Myers both into death row before their trial, which is illegal. It's not constitutional and it's not right at all. Placed them both on death row, and it affected Myers so negatively that he ended up having to be institutionalized in a mental health facility for evaluation. And following the evaluation, he told Sheriff Tate, "I will tell you anything you want to know. Just get me off of death row." So, of course, the trial proceeded, and Sheriff Tate also found two other random strangers, Mr. Billy Hooks and a Mr. Hightowers, to testify that they had seen Walter McMillan's lowrider vehicle on the scene of the murder on the day of the murder. So the case was built off of this evidence alone. This circumstantial witness evidence was the only evidence that the prosecution had against Walter McMillan. Walter McMillan's family claimed that Walter was at a fish fry on the day of the murder. He couldn't have done the murder. And several witnesses placed him at that fish fry. His family, his church members, other people who came to purchase the fish, everybody placed Walter at this fish fry on the day of the murder. So they alleged that it was impossible that Walter was able to commit the murder because he had an alibi. But the prosecution did not care about this evidence. They cared about a conviction. So they gathered all this evidence, brought it to trial, and Walter was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. So then we jump to chapter 9. It's titled "I'm Here." So this chapter, Brian Stevenson and Michael Connors are gathering and preparing evidence for a evidentiary hearing, a Rule 32 hearing. Now, at this point in time, Myers has come to Stevenson and advised that his testimony was false. He grew a conscience while he was in prison in a group therapy session, and he admitted that he lied, and he put an innocent man behind bars. So he came and approached Stevenson and told him that he was willing to testify that he lied. So Stevenson and Michael Connors, his associate, were gathering this evidence, gathering witness testimonies to prove to the court that the evidence that was presented in the original trial was false and flawed, and that it should be overturned and overruled and excluded. So this whole case is just focused on dismantling the lies that were told in the original case. So Myers took the stand and he testified that his original testimony was false. He was coerced and pressured and threatened to be sent to the electric chair if he didn't indicate that McMillan was the murderer. They also brought up a Clay Cast, who was a mechanic who worked on McMillan's vehicle, and Clay Cast indicated that the low rider modification that was added to McMillan's vehicle was not added until 6 months after the Rhonda Morrison murder. So this invalidates the claim by Mr. Hooks and Mr. Hightower that they had seen a low rider vehicle at the scene of the crime on the day of the murder. They also brought up a Woodrow Eichner, who's a former Monroeville police officer, and he advised that the body of Rhonda was not where Myers had described it in his testimony. And when he was pressured to get on the stand and lie about the body being dragged, he refused, and he was subsequently discharged and relieved of his duties from the police department because he would not get on the stand and lie and say that her body was dragged to a different location. Finally, Stevenson and Connors also brought up doctors from the mental health facility who worked with Myers when he was going through his mental health evaluation, and they also confirmed his testimony, that his testimony was false. So then we go to chapter 10, mitigation. This chapter discusses how mental health and the death penalty were major issues during the time as well. Starts by discussing how there were efforts to deinstitutionalize mentally ill clients during the 1960s and the 70s, but there was also the spread of mass imprisonment during this time. So, in an effort to deal with mental health, jail and prison time were used to substitute, mental health treatment. So Stevenson represented two clients during this time. The first client is Mr. George Daniel. George Daniel had a mental disability that stemmed from a car accident and a head injury. Mr. Daniels was convicted of capital murder and killing a police officer when he resisted arrest after he wandered into a stranger's residence. Now, a Dr. Ed Sager testified at Daniel's original trial that Daniel was not suffering from a mental illness and that he was competent to stand trial. It later was revealed that Dr. Ed Sager was not a doctor at all. He didn't have a medical license and he was an imposter. So eventually his claims were invalidated and George's ruling was overturned and he was uh, institutionalized at a mental health facility. Now, that was a good outcome of that case. The next case that was discussed in this chapter is the case of Avery Jenkins. Avery Jenkins also had a mental illness, and he also had a history of childhood physical abuse. Now, Mr. Jenkins killed a man. He stabbed him to death because he thought he was a demon after he wandered into his house during a psychotic episode. Now, at the original trial, Avery's original lawyer presented no evidence of Avery's mental incapacities. And during appeal, Stevenson argued that his counsel was ineffective. It provided no evidence of his mental disability, and therefore, he ultimately won Jenkins a new trial, got him off death row, and into a mental health facility. So then we go to chapter 11. It's titled I'll Fly Away. So Stevenson's law office began getting repetitive bomb threats regarding the McMillan case. They lived in a constant state of fear and harassment from people who were displeased with the work that they were attempting to do. In regards to the evidentiary hearing, Judge Norton ultimately denied overturning the previous judgment because he argued that Myers perjured himself. Whether he perjured himself at the original trial or this trial, the judge could not determine. So he overturned the hearing. He didn't even consider all of the other testimony that was provided. But Stevenson wasn't shocked by this. He knew his best hope was in the Court of Alabama Appeals. Stevenson during this time was also debating on whether Walter's story should be publicized in a major news outlet. Local news outlets had painted Walter as a drug dealer, a sexual sadist, and just an evil person in general, and it really painted a negative light of Walter. During this time in the Deep South, there was a lot of disdain, particularly by local officials, towards major news outlets who tried to cover civil rights issues and official misconduct. There were civil suits that were filed against news outlets for defamation, and a lot of the time the local officials won until the New York Times versus Sullivan Supreme Court case, which established a new standard for defamation and libel cases that required plaintiffs to prove malice, which is the evidence of knowledge on the part of the publisher that a statement is false. So this marked a significant turning point in press coverage of civil rights issues and official misconduct. So Stevenson decided to go ahead and do a 60-minute CBS special interview regarding the case, and he just highlighted the evidence and the lack of consistencies and the recanted testimony of Mr. Myers. Now, this coverage gave the community a summary of the evidence, and it began to create questions and doubt about Walter's case. Business leaders started to be concerned because they believed that this CBS show showed Monroeville in a negative racist light, and they began to press and start asking questions to law enforcement officials and the new prosecutor, Mr. Chapman. So, following the hearing, the new prosecutor on the case, Mr. Chapman, began to have doubts about law enforcement testimony and the previous work of the previous prosecutor, Mr. Pearson, and he ordered a ABI, which is Alabama Bureau of investigation into the case. Now, the ABI eventually found that McMillan could not have killed Rhonda Morrison. Matter of fact, they were in disbelief of how he was even convicted of killing her in the first place based on the evidence that was presented. And the ABI was formulating a report to begin to submit, and they brought this to Bryan Stevenson's attention. Now, Bryan Stevenson, when he heard this news, he was over the moon, and he was ready for Walter to be released the next day. But the ABI said, well, in order to maintain the status quo, we're just going to hold on and work on this report for a couple of months, and Walter will have to stay in prison for a few more months. And Bryan Stevenson was like, he was irate because at this point in time, McMillan had been in jail for 6 years for a crime that he did not commit. And he said, he told them an innocent man has been in prison for 6 years. Another day in prison is torture. Any extra day in prison is torture. But regardless, a few months passed and the ABI's report came out, and the Court of Criminal Appeals ended up invalidating Walter's conviction and death sentence, and they ordered a new trial. So Stevenson then filed a motion to dismiss the charges, and the state ended up joining the motion and dismissing the charges. So the judge granted the motion to dismiss the charges, setting Walter free, and it was greatly celebrated amongst his family and friends and in the community. However, even upon his release, McMillan still faced many difficulties. For instance, his wife, Minnie, did not want Walter to return home because the stress, stigma, and trauma of the trial and what was done to the family was just too much for her. And it just goes to show the long-lasting effects of capital punishment, wrongful conviction on innocent people even when they're released. And concludes this chapter by saying, it was far too easy to convict this man of a crime that he did not commit, and it was far too hard to win his freedom after proving his innocence. And he said there's much work that needs to be done in the system. So then we go to chapter 12, Mother. So this chapter follows a different story. It follows the story of Marsha Colby. She was a wife, mother of 6 kids, and she found out she was pregnant with her 7th child at 43, following her family essentially losing everything in Hurricane Ivan. So she couldn't afford to go to a doctor, she couldn't afford prenatal care, and she ended up delivering a stillborn baby in a bathtub in a FEMA camper. She and her family had a private funeral and buried the baby. But one of her nosy neighbors grew concerned because they knew she was pregnant and they knew she didn't have a baby. They called the police, who ended up finding the baby buried, and a forensic pathologist conducted an examination, and she believed that the baby was alive at birth. Now, Colby was arrested and charged with capital murder. And this case caught a lot of media attention because mothers killing their babies was just really sickening, and it just was really a top news story at this time. So Miss Colby was sentenced to life without parole. She was found guilty, and in her prison, she experienced overcrowding and poor conditions of the women who were there at the prison. Well, with the help of Mr. Stevenson, they were able to eventually get Marsha released and get her a new trial with expert witnesses. Now, Marsha, even though she was happy to be released, she was still concerned for the women she left behind, and she was concerned for the women who possibly had similar stories and didn't get the help that she received. The final chapter, chapter 13, Recovery, is just detailing life after prison for Walter and Brian. So, Walter and Brian traveled to many legal conferences, and they spoke about Walter's experience with the death penalty. They even validated, discussed the arguments of circumstantial evidence and how his whole case was based on circumstantial evidence, no physical evidence, no weapons found, nothing, just flawed witness testimony. And Walter suffered from many negative consequences following his wrongful conviction. I mean, he suffered from nightmares. He was fearful of death every day that he was on death row. The chapter also discusses how most people who are released, who are wrongfully convicted, receive no monetary assistance. And this was an issue for Walter. He struggled financially following being released. He ended up getting back into his logging business till he suffered an injury and began working at another business. But money was tight. So in the meanwhile, Stevenson worked on filing a civil suit. Now, all the defendants in the civil suit were, of course, law enforcement officials who all claimed immunity. And they ended up reaching a settlement, which was not to the immediate satisfaction of Stevenson because he wanted more money. Moreover, Sheriff Tate, the infamous sheriff, was reelected as sheriff and remained in office. Walter still was dealing with financial pressures, and Brian was also dealing with financial issues himself. 1994, a majority conservative Congress eliminated federal aid for death row prisoners. Now, Brian's firm was already overextended, overworked, but this really put a lot of pressure on them in the work that they do. But they pursued on and they continued representing their clients because they support the cause with their heart and their spirit. And Stevenson's law firm ended up being selected for a Swedish Human Rights Award. It's the Olof Palme International Human Rights Award. And a Swedish film crew ended up doing an interview of Stevenson and Walter regarding the whole ordeal. And at the end of the interview, Walter said he lost his wife, his job, his reputation, and his dignity. And it just goes to show that even though he was released and now he's free, he lost so many years of his life and he still ended up losing everything behind a false conviction based on false testimony, based on political aims and gains, based on racial prejudice. This man's whole life changed and was negatively affected. And it just goes to show that there's still a lot of work to do in the criminal justice system. Even though this happened in 1986, this is a very powerful book. And 1986 is not too far from where we are right now. So, in summation, this is a really good book. I encourage you all to finish the rest of the book. Watch the movie; it's really good. It talked about a lot of issues with capital punishment, with arbitrary sentencing and proportionality, all of the things that we've discussed already in the classroom. And it's a really good way to end off the semester. So I only have one question for you all. This case was riddled with official misconduct and poor behavior. And as we can see from the outcomes, not much was done to the people who lied and ruined an innocent man's life at the end of the day. So, my question is, what do you think is the proper punishment for official misconduct in court cases? Me personally, I believe that they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The same way that Walter was dragged through the court system, they should be dragged through the court system as well. And I know today times have changed and a lot of laws have changed, but a lot of things are still the same. We still see cases where officials get away with committing crimes, essentially. Crimes that are severe civil rights violations. So I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for listening. I look forward to reading your discussion post, and everybody have a great day.